Hey, good evening, everybody. We'll give it just a minute or two to let the box fill up here, and then we'll get started. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks, everybody, for taking the time to join us this evening. If you were trying to connect to the Coastal Steelhead season planning process town hall meeting number 2, you're in the right spot. This is the second of 3 town hall meetings that we have on the calendar. This evening, we want to focus on the regs for the upcoming season. We got about a 25-minute presentation for you, and we're going to devote the rest of our time to hearing your thoughts and ideas. At the first meeting, we kind of ran out of time, so I ask you that if you are providing comments, to keep them brief and try to allow for as many comments as possible. We will be, out of respect for your time, we will be ending right at 8 o'clock. So again, another reason to be brief with your comments. If we call on you and somebody has already said what's on your mind, it's okay to say, yeah, what Bob said or what he said or what she said, that's fine. But again, we want to try to hear from as many folks as possible. We do have our webpage that I want to remind you about, where we're taking comments through that portal. So if we don't get to you tonight, please log on to the website and leave your comments with us in that space. With that, I might introduce myself. My name is Kelly Cunningham. I'm the director of the fish program. We've got the Region 6 team here with us tonight. James Losey will be taking the reins and leading us through this brief presentation. And James, I'll turn it over to you to introduce the team.
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, my name's James Losey. I'm the regional program manager for Region 6. That's the coastal region, South Puget Sound, Hood Canal, and the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Tonight, we're going to be focused on coastal steelhead, as Kelly mentioned. We are focused specifically on these proposals. We want to hear what you think, what your expectations are for the season. So we're going to focus on that. And for that reason, I invited my colleagues here that specifically manage those fisheries we're talking about, just so we can streamline these proposals right to the people that are getting to work evaluating them. So I'm just going to quickly introduce the folks that are on the call with us. I'll start with Leah Snyder. She's going to be our host tonight. So thanks, Leah, for joining us. And then I'm just going to go in order on my screen. Amy Edwards is the stock assessment bio across the region. Jenny Whitney is the senior level bio in the coastal region, specifically the Olympic Peninsula. Jody Pope's our senior bio in the southern piece of the coastal region, so that's Willapa Bay. Next, I see on my screen Toby Harbison. Toby's a research scientist in Region 6. Rob Allen. Rob leads hatchery operations in the coastal region. Hey, Rob. Mike Scharf is the senior level bio in Grace Harbor. Thanks for joining us, Mike. And then we also have Aaron Couch here with us from our communications department. So thanks for all you're doing, Aaron. So I'm going to jump right in here. And then actually, I'm going to take a pause and I'm going to hand the mic over to Leah. Do you mind walking through this slide for us, Leah?
Yeah, sorry. So I'm just going to briefly go over Zoom directions and etiquette. All callers are muted upon entry. You can type a question through, you can type a tech question through our chat function. Our Q&A is actually turned off for this Zoom. Or you can raise your hand. That is at the bottom of your screen under the reactions tab. If you're calling in, you can raise your hand by dialing *9 on your phone. And if you're dialing in from a computer, you can find the hand at the bottom of your screen. Sorry, I jumped ahead. When you are calling on for a question or comment, we encourage you to speak up and provide comments live. To speak, you will need to unmute yourself by using the mute button on your computer or mobile device, or enter *6 if you're calling from a landline. And I will actually have to enable your mute, so I will call upon you when I've enabled you and allowed it to unmute itself. You can please limit your questions to one at a time. If you have technical questions during the webinar, please drop us a note in the chat and we will help you through it. Be respectful of others. Please be tough on the issues and questions, not on the people or organizations. No personal attacks, insults, or threats. Listen and assume positive intentions from those speaking. Speak and act professionally. No offensive, disrespectful, or derogatory language, including profanity. Assume positive intentions. Just to reiterate that. Share questions or comments in written format online at www.wa.gov/coastal-steelhead. And please, again, limit questions to one at a time. And there you go, James. It's all yours.
Thanks, Leah, appreciate that. I'm going to keep moving, but I do want to highlight that the text in bold there, that link's going to be important for folks, and you're going to see it throughout the presentation. So if you didn't have your pen out, you'll get a chance to write that website down. So this is what we're going to talk about today. This is the planned agenda. On the right here, I have a map of Region 6. We're focused, of course, on the coastal region tonight. So I've listed those rivers that we'll focus on, but we know there's other independent tributaries that aren't listed on that map. The first topic is a quick background and any updates from the last town hall meeting we had. But we're going to spend really short amount of time on that. Then we're going to talk briefly about the 2021-22 season. So we did that at the last town hall. A lot of information was shared. So I encourage folks to go back and look at that. I've got 1 or 2 slides just that I think are really important to frame up this discussion on fisheries for next year. And then this last bullet, this is really where the bulk of the information is. So we're going to talk briefly about the management framework that we use here at Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and discuss regulatory options that we've heard to date. So we're really hoping the bulk of this conversation tonight is going to be focused around options we haven't heard or options that we've shared that folks have strong opinions about. You notice on the agenda here, there's not a place where we're going to vote. That's not how we're going to do this. We're not going to make any decisions tonight. This is really our last opportunity to sit together here virtually and share these opinions or fisheries ideas, maybe things we haven't heard of. I also want to mention, though, when we sign off, I'm assuming we'll stimulate some conversation that maybe will bring some new ideas that we haven't thought of. So we've got a couple weeks here before decisions are made. So I really encourage folks over the next couple of weeks, reach out to the people that are on the line here, send us an email, and make sure if you've got a big idea, we get to hear it, because we're going to evaluate all of those proposals. So we'll jump in here with this background and updates topic. So this is our preseason schedule. Make sure folks know where we're at today. This is town hall number 2. It's November 10th. And so this is our final preseason planning town hall. But again, we've got a couple weeks here still to hear your proposals. The work here that began this preseason schedule, this is mostly offline, the work we do behind the scenes with our tribal co-managers, where we're collecting the data on the spawning grounds. We're entering those data into computers, and then QA/QC and analysis, and it gets us to where we're at in October 20th for the first town hall, and then where we're at today. There's other opportunities for folks to engage here. I haven't listed the numerous commission meetings or fish committee meetings where we brief the fish committee on the work that we're doing here and our progress. So in the bottom right is that same web page we referenced earlier. There's a full timeline of all the opportunities folks have to jump into this process, get engaged, and share their thoughts on it. Kelly also mentioned a web portal. I just want to make sure everybody knows all these places they can, get their voice heard. We also have this web portal at this same website. Since our last town hall, we've had a couple dozen new proposals or ideas come through that web portal. We've explored all of those, so really encourage folks to keep using that over the next couple weeks. So now I'm going to just briefly mention what we know about last season. A couple slides here that I think are important. So folks should be pretty familiar with this one. We've showed it, I think, every town hall for the last couple of years. What this slide is demonstrating is changes in run size over time of these coastal steelhead populations. So we can see on the bottom here on the x-axis, we're moving through time up to last season. The number we're looking at on the vertical axis, this is the number of adult steelhead that entered these rivers prior to fisheries. So this is the total run size for each of these streams. And they're stacked on top of each other. So you can see in the coastal region, we see over this short time series, a maximum of just greater than 60,000 wild steelhead returning to these rivers. And then in recent years, we've seen about half of that. So this last year's run size is estimated at 28,406. That's slightly up from the year prior, but within that 5-year average. I showed this table at our last town hall meeting and it hasn't changed, but I think it's nice for people to see that same graph, but broken down by river with real numbers. And so that's what you're seeing on the far left here. You can see each river. And then the second column here is the predicted run size pre-season. So another way to think of that is that was our forecast when we met here last year. And then right next to that, you can see what actually returned. So we had a prediction pre-season, and then once all the numbers came in, we could see what actually returned. A thing to note here is that our predictions were relatively close in most systems to the actual run size. Specifically, like in Willapa Bay, we predicted 3,188 fish would return to the river. But when all the numbers came in and we looked at encounter rates and estimated exploitation, along with the number of fish on the spawning grounds, our total was closer to 3,753. So higher than was expected. But then you can look at places like Chehalis where it was the opposite. We predicted 5,681. And we saw 5,378. So that's how this table works. A couple other things to highlight. This third column represents our escapement goal. So that's our main management objective associated with steelhead abundance. So this is the number of fish that we're targeting to reach the spawning grounds. So in the case of the Willapa Bay system, you can see we have an escapement goal of 4,206. And in this system, the actual run size was less than that before anyone went fishing. 3,700 was less than 4,200. When the season was all said and done, we had a total escapement of 3,456 in Willapa Bay. So that's about 800 below the goal. It's also worth highlighting in places like Chehalis, we were significantly below the goal, specifically over 3,000 fish under escaped in the Chehalis River. But then we had other places not highlighted in gray, like the Hoe and the Quileute, where we exceeded our escapement goal. So more fish on the spawning grounds than our management objective. Overall, this bubble here just shows that we forecasted within 5% of the actual run size. So that's really good forecasting accuracy. And the escapement goals weren't met in 5 of the 7 rivers. So these are the ones highlighted in gray. So that's our review from last year. And again, I think we showed it there in 2 or 3 slides. In the last town hall a few weeks ago, I think we had maybe a dozen slides on this topic. So feel free to go back and watch that recording if you're interested in that information. So this last bullet and the bulk of what we're going to talk about tonight is how we manage a steelhead and then regulatory options we've been exploring. So this is a similar table to the one you looked at, but different information. So now we're looking forward to the expectation for this next year. So again, the streams are listed from top to bottom. And you can see in the second column, this is our forecast for the upcoming steelhead season. So this is our expectation for fish before fisheries occur. So when they enter the river. And then we have those same escapement goals that you saw before. Those aren't changing each year. They're stable. And then this third column represents the wild steelhead that are expected to return relative to the goal. So this number is either positive or negative. If the number is negative, that suggests that we have fewer steelhead showing up than the expectation for the escapement goal or a management objective. So the expectation there, to be clear, is that we would not meet our escapement goal. And then in the right here, I've highlighted, this is our sport impact limit. So this is going to be a really critical number for us here on this call to think about when we're managing fisheries. And specifically what this means in Willapa Bay is there's 353 wild steelhead that will be targeting or allowed I'm going to rephrase that. There's 353 mortalities available to design a fishery. And I want folks to recognize, so we have a forecast of 3,535 and an escapement goal of 4,206. We talked about this in depth last time we met, but it's worth noting if the forecast is expected to come in below the goal, then we manage fisheries to a 10% exploitation rate or lower. So the math is pretty simple in places like Willapa Bay. 10% of 3,535 is 353, and that's this sport impact limit. So this is 10% of the run size. In places like the Quileute River, all the way to the bottom of the table, we have a forecast that's expected to exceed our escapement goal. So there, our management objective is to meet our escapement goal. So this gives us about 3,444 fish above the goal to design both tribal and state fisheries with our co-managers. So if we divide those shares 50-50, there's 1,722 fish available in the Quileute River to design a fishery around. So I'm just pausing because I shared a lot of information there and I want to make sure folks get a chance to see this table, but we can revisit it because we'll have plenty of time for questions. I was reminded that I didn't share hatchery steelhead forecasts in our last town hall. It's important to note the main constraint around our fisheries this year are going to be low wild steelhead abundance, as we've already talked about. But it's also nice, I think, important to see the number of hatchery steelhead we expect to come back to these rivers. And I think it also highlights that the hatchery steelhead are not the limiting factor here. In all of these systems, we're expecting enough fish for broodstock, certainly, to return to these hatcheries, but also to support fisheries in places we can design conservation-minded fisheries to protect wild steelhead. So a couple of things to note here. In the coastal region, we have both these early winter, so we call these segregated steelhead programs, but we also have these late winter, or folks refer to as broodstock programs. So these are integrated hatchery programs. I won't read through each one of these, but there have been places folks have highlighted the desire to harvest hatchery steelhead, specifically in places where we have the highest conservation concern. So you can think about places like Skookumchuck, so this is abbreviated here, where we're expecting 2,011 fish to show up to the river. So that's a Chehalis Basin tributary. And then also we can see in the Quinault River, we've highlighted one of the tribal facilities, 5,253 fish expected to return. And then I've also included the Bogus Shield late winter program. So folks that were used to targeting those programs know that we're expecting 0 fish to come back from that program because those releases have been shifted toward the early program. So that happened years ago, but we're seeing that last year was the last year we expect to see those fish return. So those are your hatchery steelhead forecasts. So before we dig into how we're managing these fisheries and consider proposals, it's important folks know the things that are going to limit right out the door what we can and can't do. So we have this list of considerations or constraints. It's important to know for steelhead, we have limited in-season tools. We can think of dam counts on the Columbia River. We don't have many places where trapping and counting steelhead. There's a lot of effort shift uncertainty. So when we close one system, it's uncertain what's going to happen in the next system over relative to anglers moving from one river to the next. The reason it's uncertain is because we don't have a history of sport fish monitoring. So this is a limitation until we have a better monitoring program in place and we can understand how anglers move, sort of that angler behavior component. So there's a lot of forecasting uncertainty. Up until last year, we had a real history of over forecasting or over predicting. Some of our methods have changed, but steelhead populations have really stabilized over the last few years. So our forecasting accuracy has improved in part because steelhead variability has declined. We have tribal co-managers. In every system, we have tribal co-management agreements that we move forward with to support these fisheries and our conservation objectives, with the exception of Willapa Bay. There's no estimates of mortality associated with poaching at this time, and those aren't included in these estimates we talk about, so it's worth having in the back of our head. And then I already mentioned the sport fish monitoring is a real gap for us. So we don't have unbiased estimates of total sport impact, really in any systems, but they're slowly improving in some. So I think this is kind of the last background slide I wanted to share. So our guiding document for managing steelhead in Washington State is a statewide steelhead management plan. I want to make sure folks know they can get that online. It's not a really long document, but it describes the foundation of the decisions we make. When folks are leaving this call and thinking about new proposals, I really want to make sure folks are thinking about these 4 parameters that are highlighted in the statewide steelhead management plan. And everybody on this call that's working for the agency is considering when we're evaluating proposals. So I've walked in depth through these 4 parameters in past meetings and a few weeks ago. So I'm just going to highlight that abundance, that's the metric we've been talking most about, is important. And that's mostly what we're going to focus on. But we're also thinking really hard about steelhead productivity, both spatial and temporal distribution. So where and when are these fish moving into our rivers, and designing fisheries that protect that full suite of steelhead distribution. And then also steelhead diversity. So these are little snippets, I guess, of graphs that I've shown in these past town halls. So you can dig into those more in those recordings online. Okay, so this slide here lists really general categories that I think contain all of the proposals we've heard to date. And so one of the pieces of feedback would be nice to hear is if we've missed your proposal. It looks like, you know, your voice or your thoughts haven't been heard. But we think that these proposals here cover our bases in terms of making sure we're exploring all these available options we've heard. But we're really encouraging folks to add more bullets on here if there's things we're missing. So, and then in the bottom here, I've put these 4 boxes. Those are those 4 parameters I talked about in the last slide. And just so folks know that these are the considerations we're thinking of. And when all of those boxes are painted green, these are the proposals we're most likely to move forward with. So I'm going to read these. This first fishery proposal is a coast-wide closure. Every year, but more in the last couple of years, we're hearing proposals from folks that feel that we should move forward with the maximum conservation-minded approach with the least amount of risk. And so that would be closing all fisheries on the coast. So that's a proposal we've evaluated. Number 2 is the status quo. The easiest way to understand what the status quo proposal is to open the pamphlet. So these are the permanent rules for each river. And so that's a proposal where some folks are arguing that we should go back to how we were fishing 4 or 5 years ago. Number 3 are last year's regulations. So in most cases, this, in short, was no fishing from a boat, prohibiting the use of bait, and closing the month of April. Some fisheries were already closed in April. Some only had 2 weeks in April. But in general, last year's regulation, we're describing this no boat, no bait, no April. But as we know, there's an exception or two to that last year. We were able to describe a little bit more opportunity for fishing out of a boat than we had in previous years. Number 4 is a status quo with reduced days a week. So there's some places where the status quo just does not make sense to meet our management objectives. And you'll see that in the next slide. So some are asking us, if we reduce the days a week, would we encounter fewer steelhead and support a fishery where we can go back to fishing the way that we're used to, from a boat or with bait? Number 5 is status quo and select waters, very similar, but maybe we can limit these status quo fisheries, allow people to fish from their boat or with bait in certain parts of the water shed that would also meet our management objectives. Number 6 is similar. Could we reduce the hours in a day that you're allowed to fish? So maybe just mornings are open, and that would protect a portion of the steelhead run that moves through these fisheries in the evening. So like afternoon hours. Number 7 would be last year's regulations. So this is like no boat, no bait, no April, but reduce the days. So folks are bringing this one up in places where the margin is so tight, where maybe like the hump tulips, where we saw that there's, about 61 fish available in terms of mortalities. So could we just maximum restriction and only allow us to fish a couple days a week? Would that get us back on the water? And then 8, to be fair, is encompasses a lot of big ideas that we've heard. So there's a lot of folks that in places specifically like the Chehalis that understand the conservation objectives and the concern and the declining steelhead abundance, but are asking us to just continue to think hard about places we could fish targeting hatchery fish only. So we're going to talk about that and some ideas we've got to sort of explore that proposal. And then I put an asterisk here at the bottom that describes this lake planting of surplus hatchery steelhead. So we did that last year, really limited capacity, but we've had many folks ask us to keep doing it. And if we end up with surplus hatchery steelhead, this is a use of them that they're pretty excited about. So I just have a couple more slides here, but they're really based around this table. So I'm going to pause for a minute and just make sure folks get a look at this table and walk through so we all understand it. So on the left here, what we're looking at again are these watersheds from top to bottom. And I've just copied and pasted this sport impact limit that you saw in previous tables. So these are the number of mortalities that we're limited to meet our management objectives. Specifically in Willapa Bay, we have 353 mortalities available, but no more, because the management objective is to not exceed that number. Each box here, or I should say at the top here, I've listed all those proposals I just walked through in the bulleted list before, and they're named in a very similar way. So if you've got these slides on your end, you can flip back and forth and double check what we're looking at. But then I've color-coded each box that represents a fishery proposal that if we move forward with would either have a river be open or closed. I'm going to walk through this really slowly in the next couple slides using the same table, but I want to share a couple other things. I've put these little symbols in the bottom. So we've done math to support or argue that these proposals would not meet our management objectives. But there's a lot of uncertainty with these numbers. And so that's what these symbols are highlighting. So this arrow here describes this concern for shifts in effort. So I've put this box, this arrow here in places like the Quileute for the status quo fishery. This would be the only place potentially that's green that would support this type of regulation. So folks that are interested in fishing from their boat, if this was the only place available to do it, it's uncertain how anglers would behave and move to that watershed. And then another place sort of worth mentioning this, I think, since we're on this arrow, is in the Hoh River. We can see that 298 fish with a sport impact limit, maximize at 298 fish. And our estimates of encounters, sport anglers fishing with last year's rule, it looks like we could support that effort. But again, the margin is tight. So we just want to keep that in mind. Then these other asterisks describe things that are not accounted for in this table. So any regulation we want to move forward with, if we find out from the public that there's some suite of regulations that are favorable, we're going to work closely with our co-managers to describe those and why we feel they're responsible in meeting our conservation objectives. And then illegal catch and over forecasting are things that we're trying to get our hands wrapped around in terms of these spreadsheets and the modeling, but for now they're not included in these estimates. So I just want to describe a scenario where if many folks from the public are arguing for a full closure, how this matrix, if we highlight that, how it would affect your fisheries. So a full closure alternative is pretty easy to imagine. So I've highlighted these, and I realize it's tough to see, but I've just made these boxes bold. So what this is describing is if we move forward with the full closure, of course, all the boxes would be red because we would be closing fishing. Make sure we're all on the same page with how this table is working. But there's also folks that really like what happened last year, but also suggest that not fishing from a boat, prohibiting the use of bait, and closing April is something that makes sense while we're in this sort of conservation-minded, low abundance period. So if we decided, so if we decided to move forward with that proposal, you can see I've colored those boxes green with the no bait, no boat, no April. So if we just went across the board, all along the coast, we move forward with that regulation, we'd have openers in those green boxes. So that'd be the Hoe and the Quileute, Upper Quinault, and Willapa. But then we'd have, of course, places like the Chehalis, the Hump Tulips, Queets, and Clearwater that would be closed under that regulation because the impacts would exceed these sport impact limits. But then we can also, this I realize is now very hard to see now that I'm seeing on my screen, but I've put bold around individual green boxes. And this is another avenue we could move forward with potentially, and we're exploring is crafting, sort of this maximum amount of opportunity that's supported for each one of these rivers. So in a place like Willapa, we might have a no boat, no bait, no April, and that looks to be supported based on our estimates. But then when you move to the Chehalis, every box is red, so there's really no option at this point. And then in the Hump Tulips, you might find yourself in a place where there's no bait, no April, no boat, but we've reduced the days even further, so maybe Sundays only. So this is the way we're considering these proposals. And then, of course, we could look at places like the Hoe and the Quileute, where we have these more liberal regulations. Specifically in the Quileute, we move back to a status quo fishery. So I just want to describe how the table works and how we could move through these different options, but also how we're thinking about this, where these rivers are not all connected. There's a suite of options we could apply to each one of these rivers and manage them independently. So there's one option I didn't discuss, and maybe before I just show this, I'll go back to this table. I want to highlight that in places like the Chehalis, every box is red. So using these options, it's been really difficult to craft a fishery. And then in the Hump Tulips, we're in a really similar situation. 61 fish is not many if you open an entire watershed to a fishery, or even consistent with the pamphlet distribution of these fishing opportunities. So we've looked really hard every year. I would argue that this year we've spent significant amount of time and some late nights trying to understand how we could have a hatchery-directed fishery specifically. And so I think this is kind of the last thing I want to talk about, but I think it's a really important one because we're getting a lot of feedback that surplus hatchery fish are not something we're interested in. These are meant to be in the creel or harvested. So the goal of this work was to design fisheries that meet management objectives and also provide opportunity to harvest hatchery origin steelhead, specifically where the conservation concern is the greatest, because that's been the bottleneck the last few years, places like the Chehalis. So our strategy here has been to focus this limited amount of creel or sport fish monitoring around the highest priority fisheries and monitor at extremely high precision and accuracy these fisheries in real time. So have weekly updates on the impacts occurring. So I will say this is a creel like we've never seen in the coastal region. What we're describing is this strategy, but we have used it in other parts of the state. where resources are available. And we do have the expertise in-house here to apply it. The resources just have not been available. So what we're talking about here is shifting not all, but a high proportion of the resources for sport fish monitoring around these hatchery rack settings. So some special considerations with this proposal, tribal co-managers are a big part of this discussion, because many of these rivers are places we've agreed with our co-managers that there's not room for available impacts on wild steelhead. So that discussion is occurring right now. We have limited monitoring resources. I think I've talked a lot about that, but it's real. And a fishery where you have 61 fish or 150 fish in a large basin, or specifically 198 fish in a large basin like the Chehalis, this monitoring aspect becomes extremely important. And then, of course, there's increased potential for early closures. So when we have a small number of fish, the margin of error is extremely tight. And so we know as we continue to manage to these tight margins, there's just increased potential for closing early and complex regulations. So to share just briefly the way we would be looking at this, this is a pretty busy slide, but I think it's really important for folks that are targeting this proposal. So what we're looking at on the left is a table of these tributaries that folks are familiar with in the Chehalis Basin. So that's really important. We're just looking at the Chehalis here as an example. And we've taken those 198 impacts available on the Chehalis, and we've apportioned them to these independent tributaries based on their relative contribution to the total run size. So if we remember, we want to protect the diversity and distribution of steelhead both across space and time. So if we do that across space, all 198 of those impacts cannot occur in one part of the Chehalis. So we've spread that risk across the watershed relative to how these fish traditionally return. So what that means is in places like the Wishkah, 11 of those impacts could be assigned to the Wishkah River to design a fishery. We would then take those 11 impacts and spread them across the run to spread the risk across the run timing and not disproportionately affect the early or the late end of the run. So if you imagine taking these 11 Wishkah impacts and dividing them into December and into January and February and March, these numbers get much smaller and the margin gets even tighter. So we've taken the proposals we've heard and our limited monitoring, and we've focused on a few key areas where we know folks are interested in fishing, specifically on these coho fisheries in December that have been closed due to the steelhead concerns. So that would be a fishery like in the Satseup. And then also places where we've got robust hatchery populations returning that we haven't had access to. So this is specifically like the Wainuchi and the Skookumchuck. So one thing we want to hear from folks today, so this map here on the right, it highlights these areas that are in blue and these areas we've focused on, but we want to hear from folks if we have monitoring to choose one of these places to go fishing, or if we generate additional resources and bodies by January to increase monitoring, or by February, and we get these people hired up and we look under the couch cushions and we find the money, we want to have a priority list. Which of these do we open as resources become available? So I also, just one other note on this. I mentioned that these fisheries become relatively unstable. So there's potential for emergency regulation changes. And so the way we are considering this is if you looked at a place like Skookumchuck, where there's 9 fish available, and you divide those fish up across the run timing, we know those that fish the Skookumchuck that very few wild fish show up in December. In fact, we know about 5% of the wild fish show up in December. So if we take that 9 fish available and we take 5% of it, those are the number of fish that we would support as mortalities in December. So in some cases, this is less than 2 fish. So the way this fishery could operate is we have sport fish monitoring in the Skookumchuck real time with weekly updates. And as we see our impacts move beyond that less than 2 fish, we could close that fishery to protect that early part of the run. but then potentially have an opportunity to reopen it in January and essentially try again, and know that the impacts are slightly larger in January because more wild fish are available, but in the same way, encounters go up. So this is a new approach for us in a place like the Chehalis, where we're, potentially 3,000 fish below the goal in recent years, but we've explored this option. This last slide I have just breaks this map up. I know folks are wondering that know these watersheds, when you say Wainuchi, what do you mean? And so we can talk more in depth about this, but we've highlighted, based on proposals we've heard, these specific watersheds that we think are kind of the highest priority for folks that are proposing these hatchery-directed fisheries, or we could call them like coho-based fisheries that are affected by these steelhead regulations. So that was a lot of information I shared. Thanks for letting me go through it all. I'm welcome to go back and revisit slides. I want to reiterate that the goal here now is to hear as many proposals as we can, so we can get back to work evaluating the fisheries folks are focused on. So I really encourage that to be the focus of questions and comments, our fishery proposals, but also, as Kelly mentioned, if we can keep it brief, that'll help us achieve that goal of getting everyone a chance to say what they want. The last thing I want to note is we're not making decisions tonight. This is a listening session for us and help answer questions about those proposals that are likely to be most effective at meeting our management objectives. So now's a good time. I think we can take some questions, Leah.
Okay, and it looks like we have a hand from David. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, my question is, how low would you let the wild fish population go in the Chehalis Basin before you would consider brood stocking?
Yeah, thanks. So we talked about this last time we met, and I want to focus. So this is a good question, David. So I'm not pivoting off of it, and I'm going to have our hatchery operator, Rob Allen, jump on and help with this if we need to. But I really want to focus this discussion on short-term fishery proposals, because brood stocking today, while there's an argument that changes to hatchery practices may help recover wild steelhead, we're really not here to talk about hatchery infrastructure changes or release programs, but really proposals. But I want to highlight, we do have integrated programs, those that you're referring to as broodstock programs, also referred to sometimes as the Oregon model. So those do exist. And it's worth mentioning, in the Chehalis Basin, they exist in some cases in the places where wild steelhead are at the greatest risk. So Rob, do you want to help me? Is there anything I missed there on these integrated or wild broodstock programs for us in the coastal region?
Well, maybe I just point out the ones that we do have, the wild broodstock programs. The Upper Chehalis does 32,000 smolt release. Nawakam does 30,000. Skookumchuck does 70,000. Satsup does 55,000, and Wainuchi does 175,000 integrated. Kind of that Oregon model. Probably not the same, because we're running out of wild fish. So yeah, so we do a kind of a hybrid.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Rob.
Our next hand is from Wes. Go ahead.
Yeah, James, on the slide before the one you have up, can you illuminate how the Chehalis Sport Impact Limit is derived? Because it's clearly way different than the rest of them. It's not half of a 10% of the run. It's something totally different. So what's that about?
Yeah, Wes, thanks. That's a great question. And we talked about it a little bit in the last town hall, but it's not straightforward. Wes brings up an important point. If folks recall, when we're expected to not meet our escapement goal, there's a 10% exploitation rate maximum. So in the Chehalis, 10% of 7,114 is 711. So that's 10%. If we allocate that with our tribal co-managers 50-50, you divide 700 by half, you get 350. There's then consideration for the Chehalis tribe. So that's fisheries above the Black River. About 20% comes off of that. We have the expert on this math, Mike Scharf here, but I'll go through it quickly. So that shaves some of those fish off. And then we have the wild broodstock programs that Rob just mentioned, where we have less than 100, but about 68 or so wild fish that need to be removed from the spawning grounds to support those continued programs. So all that math is done by Mike specifically. Thanks, Mike. And we end up with 198 fish available.
That's cool. I thought it probably had something to do with the third tribe involvement, but I wasn't sure. And that's not the only, you point out, that's not the only thing that's here.
It's important though, Wes. Thanks. Mike, anything to add? Did I get that right?
The numbers weren't quite exact, but the math is there. You got the process was correct.
Thanks.
Thanks, Wes. Our next hand is from the O'Learys. Go ahead.
James, on the slide, if you can go forward to the, keep going. When you're looking at the hoe, yeah, here. So does this include regulation changes made after 2016? Because my understanding is you're now utilizing catch rates based on 2015 data. So the regulation changes in 2016 were purposely built to reduce catch impacts and also catch and release mortality impacts.
Yeah, thanks, Reve. So it's worth noting that our estimates of sport encounters are not good. We get these from sport fish monitoring. At this point, Reve, I think this is important for everybody. I think some of this you may already know, but in the Hoh River, we had a creel years ago. And this was a high precision, really well done creel. You can get the information from that creel on our Coastal Steelhead website, of course. This is what we're calling the Bentley study. In the Bentley study, we see that an encounter rate of 1.14. So every steelhead was caught one time, 1.14 times. And actually, I'm going to correct myself because these details matter, 1.13 times. And so we've applied that number to the run size. So assume the sport fishery encounters every fish 1.13 times and then apply a 10% release mortality. So that's without more robust creel in place. And that's a high priority for us, but that's the estimates we've used to estimate encounter rates and associated sport fishing mortality.
Right. So that 1.13 catching that many fish was prior to 2016 regulations. So are our tribal co-managers not okay with understanding that we made adjustments to lower that impact in 2016?
Yeah, so
no bait, no barbs, one single point hook per line, closure from fishing on sections of the hoe.
Yeah. No, so tribal co-managers understand that. And in terms of our confidence around meeting management objectives without sport fish monitoring, they really appreciate it that, we have these conservative fisheries. So I think we might be talking about two different approaches here. One of them is a post-season estimate of mortality. And here we're looking at, in the absence of monitoring, we're trying to estimate impact associated with these fisheries designed for next year. So maybe, Reve, we can schedule time to talk specifically about this in case there's some piece of the math I'm missing.
Yeah, I don't see that accounted for. I see, the regulation changes you're proposing for this year. You have ways to account for that, but regulation changes that happened after your counts for impacts have not been taken into consideration.
Okay. The good news is that won't affect these numbers we're looking at now. If the concern you have is something we dig into and there's an error in the postseason estimates, but it's not affecting this table as far as I can tell. So, but it's good feedback. So thanks.
And our next hand is from Ty. Go ahead.
Hi, guys. I want to thank all the staff everyone involved, really everyone that cares about steelhead. This is a pretty difficult subject, but onto the meat of the bones. My first suggestion, maybe, since we're transitioning into this abundance-based management plan, is that I've spent 26 years in Alaska, and they do all the same thing for salmon, but they have sliding scales for the abundance. And the reason they do that is the reason that you see abundance of steelhead right now. And I'll just use a quick case in point with the Willapa. You look at Chinook, and we're managing Chinook, although a really aggressive hatchery programs and harvest programs. But that population is basically making half its escapement all the time, right? It's only maybe in the last 22 years made escapement 5 times. So my point isn't that we're not trying to protect these fish, but set realistic goals that allow anglers to still be engaged with these fish. Because my biggest concern with steelhead is steelhead need anglers. It's not just that anglers need steelhead. The biggest advocate for these fish is the people fishing for them. So that would be my first point. My other second point would be, and it sounds like we're all beating a dead horse here, but I guess the state of Washington is defining a wild rootstock program differently in the state of Oregon. And I understand we really don't have any wild rootstock programs in the state of Washington, other than maybe some conservation-based programs in the Sound that are starting to go through. But I think something that no one's made the point and why Oregon has transitioned to this. They've transitioned to wild broodstock programs, not because they have a lot of wild fish, because it lowers their impacts. So their impacts of PHOS go down when you are doing a virtual snapshot of hatchery fish every year. That's the closest you have to the wild fish in those basins, versus integrating. And it's kind of like, it seems to me that we just need to rip the Band-Aid off and start fresh with some of these hatchery programs to lower our impacts. And it's twofold. I mean, if you look at Oregon and their wild steelhead abundance, their programs with wild steelhead, hatchery programs have some of the highest abundance. So just food for thought. I understand that all these hatchery programs we're talking about are harvest-based, not conservation-based, but possibly maybe the hatchery genetic management plans need to be rewritten for that and be conservation-based. But that's my food for thought, guys. My only other concern is that—
Hey, Ty, maybe I want to make sure everybody gets time and we focus the conversation on proposals, but I just want to highlight, we do have integrated broodstock programs in Washington State, specifically in the coastal region, and the description of our programs versus Oregon. There's some inaccuracies there. I appreciate that you're passionate about the topic, so I'm hoping you and I can schedule time to keep talking about it offline, not during this preseason planning process.
Oh, no, I just meant that the wild broodstock programs on the coast of Oregon are not integrated. They're either 100% wild or they're integrated normal hatchery programs like you guys have. That's all.
Thanks, Ty. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
And our next hand is from Rob. Rob, go ahead.
Thank you. I want to say how much I appreciate the biologists that have been working on this. I've spent quite a bit of time talking with them since the last meeting and even before the meeting. And I think we're heading in the right direction. And I appreciate the painstaking efforts that you're taking to try to find the funds to do the creel sampling that will allow us to monitor, to be able to get some of these fisheries. And I might be a little bit critical. I'm pretty passionate about things, but I really appreciate that you are working on these things. And that's all I really have to say tonight. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob.
Our next hand is from Larry. Larry, go ahead.
Hi. James, as always, I want to thank you and all your staff for all the hard work you do. I know you're working very hard on this to try and accommodate all sides. I do have a question. The sports impact limit, is that based on a 10% mortality for every contact with the steelhead by sports?
Yep. So this can be a little confusing later, but make sure we're talking about the same number. So in runs that are not expected to meet their escapement goal, the management objective is a 10% mortality. So there's that 10%. But then I think the number you're talking about is how do we estimate the number of dead fish associated with our sport fisheries that are catch and release. So in the work we do with the co-managers is we estimate non-harvest mortality. So that's the term we use for it. And the way we do that is we estimate the number of fish that will be caught, will be landed, and then we apply a 10% release mortality to those fish. So if 100 fish are caught, we assume 10 fell into that non-harvest mortality column.
Okay, that's what I thought. Have we looked at, well, I think you did, look at that recent study from Idaho that they were seeing a 4% mortality. And
Yeah.
this 10% just seems to be kind of a number we pulled out of a hat.
Yeah, it turns out 10% is a standard number that's used across the state, including the Columbia River, but there's good reason to criticize it. There's literature that suggests it's high or low, ranges from 5 to 15%. But what we do know is that we need more information on this. We need to better understand release mortality. So in places where fish are just coming out of the ocean, it's probably a lot different than places where fish have already passed 2 or 3 dams and are extremely close to spawning. So the number is probably not 10% everywhere. It's probably something different than 10%. And so refining that number will be important. So we've got some ideas on how we could do that, but this year we're definitely using 10%.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Larry.
And our next hand is from Luke. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, so I appreciate everything that everybody's doing on this, but it seems like we're fighting over crumbs at this point. If we're not expected to meet escapement goals and the margins are so thin, why are we even considering a season on most of these rivers? I mean, I do believe that steelhead need anglers to advocate for them, but at this point, we're headed towards an endangered species listing. So I guess why are we? I mean, it feels like we're more in the entertainment industry than the conservation, that we need.
Thanks, Luke. I appreciate your feedback. So and we've talked before, so it's good to see you here. I'm really excited to get some proposals here on the board from folks so we can make sure we, give these fishery rules every analysis we can possibly do to make sure we're in the right place. What I think I heard was a full closure proposal, but I want to make sure I heard it right.
Yeah, I mean, if needed, I would hate it because obviously I like to catch fish, and I do 100% believe that the fish need to have advocates for them, and that's the best way. But I mean, if we're below escapement and we have to do everything that we can. And if there is there is a mortality rate associated with releasing. I mean, like, God, when we're down to just a matter of fish, like -10, we just got to do whatever we can.
Thanks, Luke.
Thanks, Luke. And our next hand is from Patrick. Patrick, go ahead. Patrick, I see you have your hand up. You can go ahead now. Okay, we're gonna skip and we'll come back to Patrick. Next is phone number ending in 080. Go ahead. You're on the phone, so you may need to dial *6 to unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Excellent. Thank you for taking the time to answer my question. So I have a quick question and then a comment, and this is specifically about the Skookumchuck. So if you could answer the question first, I would appreciate it. So specifically the green line that I'm looking at, is that what you guys are proposing as the section to be open, possibly under these revised rules?
Yeah, I'm gonna have Mike jump in. Thanks, Mike.
Yes, that is correct. So basically it's limiting the opening to the upper section of the Skookumchuck as close to the hatcheries as we get. So we selected a bridge crossing, which is a good feature in which to put a limit on.
So my proposal, somebody who lives in this area would be, I'm a little down from where that would be, so I'd be outside of it. But I know, there's other people obviously who would be fishing there too. And I fished those areas before, and those areas are already, when open, obviously, extremely packed with people. And if you have such a small area open, I would imagine the issue would get times 10 worse. So it would be great if you guys could expand that area, maybe through at least Bucota, to expand more room for people to have access instead of such a small area of river. I would really hope you guys would take that into consideration, because I think that would greatly benefit a lot of people who live on the Skookumchuck and would visit the Skookumchuck, to avoid a complete just mess of people down there at the hatchery, which is what would happen. So I would just encourage that you please expand that to Bucota or beyond. And thank you for taking my comment and question.
Thanks. And if before you hang up there, I might ask, because this is really what we're here for. So so everyone knows, we have 4 technicians and a biologist right now for freshwater monitoring in this system. Not many. It would support some of these lines in green, but not all. So I'm curious if that extension of the Skookumchuck, if we could design a fishery expected to, result in less than 9 mortalities, would we trade that? Because freshwater monitoring is going to be the limitation as well as wild steelhead. Would we trade that for the Wainuchi or the Wishka, for instance, to extend to Skookumchuck?
Yeah, and I'm not here to propose to take anything away from anybody else. So, I mean, that's a tough question for me to answer, and I appreciate where you're coming from. But just specifically for the Skookumchuck, that is such a small area that is already jam-packed with people. And I mean, I could just imagine what that would look like in a fishing situation instead of spreading people out. And just on a personal level, I can say for the catching of wild steelhead, I fished the Skookumchuck for probably over 20 years now. The amount of hatchery you catch to wild there, I don't even, to be honest with you, recall catching a wild in the Skookumchuck or really seen many caught at all, period. And you were talking about December earlier. December, I mean, most people don't even fish the Skookumchuck in December. It's more of a January on fishery. So, and I don't need to get into the weeds of all that. I'm not interested in taking away from anybody else, but you mentioned the Wainuchi, I believe, and the areas you do have in those other rivers is greatly expanded than what you have from the Skookumchuck, for example. And I don't know if you're familiar with that area down there near where the reservoir is, but it's already, what's the term, combat fishing. And if you did it like this, I mean, I think you guys would increase that greatly down there. And a lot of people who even came would probably miss out on an opportunity, even if they went there with such a small, limited area. So I would greatly encourage to expand through at least Bucota. And thank you for asking a follow-up question. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Appreciate that.
Okay, our next hand is from Brian. Brian, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
This is this page you have up right now, the slide you have up right now is very interesting. It's the first time I've seen you apportion impacts by specific tributaries. And I'm trying to wrap my head around it a little bit. And so I guess off the top of my head comment to you would be, I think hatchery, targeted hatchery harvest is a way to try to utilize these hatchery fish that are coming back. And I think they will result in, these crowded fisheries, but I just don't see another way to do it, unfortunately, if we're going to target the hatchery fish in areas where they congregate to try to reduce impacts on wild fish. And when you're thinking about this, I do appreciate you thinking about spatial structure and diversity by apportioning the impacts across the tributaries. But I would also ask you to think about the concept of a portfolio approach. I know it's used down here on the Oregon coast, where you specifically take a little bit more risk in some areas, but you take less risk in other areas. And if you don't have fishing open in a lot of these areas, you're taking a lot less risk there. And you may be able to have a little bit more risk in an area like the Skookumchuck, or maybe even a smaller area of the Wynoochee if the fish congregate there, or the hump tulips around the hatchery. So at least to give some people an opportunity, although it will be crowded, to harvest hatchery fish where those fish tend to congregate. At least that's been my experience, is that a lot of the fish tend to congregate in certain areas, and it might provide an opportunity to harvest in just those specific areas. So I'd encourage you to think about this portfolio approach of, taking different risk profiles in different areas. Those are my comments. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Brian. And to frame your comment, I appreciate it. And so others can think about this. So that portfolio idea we've thought through in places like the Chehalis, there's an argument to be made where you could apply more risk in the places where the conservation need is less. So maybe like the Satsup is a good place where you apply increased risk. The issue we're having with these hatchery-directed fisheries is our integrated programs are located in places where the conservation risk is the greatest. So those populations appear to be declining, at a high rate relative to some others. So anyway, appreciate the feedback. I want to say too, we received a proposal from folks on the OP that described applying more risk to a place like the Solduck, where we're consistently meeting escapement in recent years, and relieving pressure on places where we have greater conservation concern in the Bogashiel. So this is cool. We're hearing these type of proposals. Where are we comfortable with the risk and where are we not? So appreciate that.
Okay, and our next hand is from Rich. Go ahead, Rich.
Hi, this is Rich. Appreciate the opportunity to comment. I guess, again, you just want to hear about proposals tonight. I'll continue to be the blowhorn about looking at things more longer term. Hopefully we'll be able to achieve some of that through the proviso and think more long term, because right now it's this yearly, every year trying to hammer our heads against what we can get out of the crumbs that are presented to us. I think in regards of proposals, I think things that people really have to keep in mind is, at the end of the day, the more effective we are, the shorter the season's going to be. And it's kind of like, that's what it really kind of boils down to. And people are fine with that. I guess people are fine with that. We talk about all this time, I hear this about we need anglers who care, or we need anglers, right? We need to have anglers, but we need anglers who really care and are willing to make adjustments in their efforts. Again, I hear so many folks trying to poke holes in the data, even questioning mortality rates and all these things. And we're down to like a few fish now. It seems like I'd like to see more of a conservation-based approach. Anyway, I have more things I'll add to the portal. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks.
Our next hand is from Patrick. Let's see if we can get you this time. Go ahead, Patrick.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hey, Patrick.
Oh, lovely. Hi. Well, first off, James, I really appreciate you breaking down those tributary specific rivers, on the Chehalis Basin. I think it's really important that the public sees those numbers. Couple of questions here, and it's more for everyone else listening in. Those, you said you took a certain amount of wilds for the brood stock. I forget what you said, 60 some fish or something like that. Are they considered lethal spawned, or does the same impact rate go into that, or are we killing that many fish after we spawn them?
Yeah, so
I'm
a
sure
couple
Rob
things.
can answer that better.
Yeah, Rob's the guy. I do want to highlight when I said 60 something, Mike let me know that number probably wasn't perfect. So the number we remove, Mike knows that number. And then the best technique for us would be to remove those fish from the spawning ground, spawn them, and then put them back. So Rob, I don't know, where are we at with the technique we're using in recent years?
So I guess I kind of missed the question.
Do we
you mean
live
as-
spawn our
live
wild brood
spawn?
stock?
Yeah, we're live spawning. Yep, males anyway.
Okay. Secondly, these
Thanks, Rob.
December impacts, or these steelhead impacts we're saving for quote unquote coho fishing, are these applying to our current status quo fishery we're conducting right now for salmon, or are we going to go to, like on the Chehalis and Satsop and stuff, are we going to go to the no bait, no boat, any of that kind of stuff, or are we going to just continue status quo if we use those impacts into December?
Not sure I fully understand, but just so if I'm thinking about this right, Patrick, in most systems in the Chehalis, we're assuming about 5% of the wild steelhead show up in December. So like folks know, a very small number. A couple of them also show up in November, but even smaller than that. So December 1, is this steelhead management period where fish are starting to enter. So you can expect these proposals we're talking about now are going to affect salmon regulations starting December 1.
So that's what I'm trying to. So for instance, the Satsop River, we have a certain amount of steelhead impacts we can burn up in there. Well, if we're salmon fishing, are we going to go from being where we are now to no boat or anything like that? Or basically, are we going to have our boats in December for our coho fishery?
Yeah. So let me show you this table again real quick, and then so this right here. So in the Satsop, there's 58 fish available in terms of impacts. We spread that over the season, 5% of this number. So that's about 3 wild steelhead mortalities are available in the month of December in Satsop. So that's 30 encounters. So if we encounter 30, then we think 10% of those will die. That's 3. So the way this would work in the Satsop is we would design a fishery in December, highly likely to encounter less than 30 steelhead. So that fishery would almost certainly require no fishing from a boat and no bait.
Okay. Final question. On the tributaries that we do have open, say if it's Wainuchi, Satsop, Skookumchuck, whatever we decide, if we have this really high precise pinpoint creeling, is there any way we can reevaluate this 1.13 encounter rate that's from the Ho River in 2014? Because I think we can all agree that the Chehalis Basin is a little different beast than the Hoh River from 8, 9, 10 years ago. Does that make sense? Can we reevaluate what numbers we're using?
So everyone, yeah, Patrick. So everyone understands the question here. The encounter rate on wild steelhead, we're assuming every fish wild steelhead gets encountered 1.13 times. So every fish gets caught. That's based on 1 year of creel. Jenny can correct me, maybe 2, but what, it's the Bentley model. So everybody on this call in the team here is excited to reevaluate that number. Applying an estimate from the Hoh from 1 or 2 years, it's our best tool, and it's not something we're extremely proud of. We need monitoring efforts. So it's worth noting that this monitoring we're talking about, high precision creel, will tell us a lot about the Skookumchuck right below the hatchery. But where we're really excited to do it is in places where we have standard traditional fisheries. So if we had a creel like this in, let's say, the Willapa or the Quileute or the Hoh, we would learn a lot about what a standard fishery, our traditional fisheries encounter. We're talking about here shifting some of those resources, if we have room for high precision creel, focusing them around hatchery racks to make sure we remove as many of those hatchery fish as we can and put them in the creel or, in people's net. So it's about limited resources and applying it to the fisheries folks want. So Patrick, the short answer is we're going to learn something about encounter rates on wild steelhead, but how Skookumchuck wild encounters represent the rest of the coast is uncertain. So.
Well, right. Okay. That
Thanks,
makes
Patrick.
sense. I appreciate your time.
Okay, and our next hand, it looks like Wes has his hand back up. Wes, go ahead.
Yep. Okay. So big new concept here. History on steelhead management is that you calculate the abundance impact you're allowed, craft a fishery that allows some intensity against it, and run it for as long as you can. And you adjust the intensity of the fishery or the measures that you put on the anglers, the restrictions, to expand that. But you always start at the beginning of the season and run it until your abundance budget runs out, right? That's the history. We've never really done it differently. It's you start in December on the hatchery fish and you run into the wild fish until you've used up your abundance and you stop. So forever, we've prioritized targeting the front half of the run in this abundance model, in this abundance focused model, and not some of the other parameters that you've talked about, which is timing and spatial distribution. And I'm kind of going, based on the slide you presented last time on the Quileute and the Hoh and the hatchery fish harvested in January and February and the relative wild impacts, you're pretty much killing a wild fish for every hatchery fish you remove. That's what your slide showed. You had like one river, you had like 25 hatchery fish and 225 wild encounters. I'm going, the justification for the early portion of the mid-January to mid-February season really isn't there from a hatchery impact management standpoint. You're eliminating very few fish for what I think are significant wild impacts, if that's your sole reason for having a fishery in the January 15th to February 15th kind of time frame, is to manage hatchery impacts. I'm kind of going, dial back the intensity on the days and the time. Stay off of, close the fisheries for 4 weeks in January 15th through February 15th, reopen them February 15th for 3 days a week through the end of March. I'm pretty sure that would bring you, under almost any of your scenarios, with whatever regulation package for fishing technique management, almost all of those are going to fit within that kind of highly reduced footprint. And you would actually take pressure off the one piece of the run that's never had pressure taken off of it. And that's like the early returning fish that everybody says are gone. And yet every year we run our seasons over them. There you go.
Thanks, Wes.
Okay, our next hand is from Brian. Brian, is that a fresh hand?
No, I'm sorry. I forgot to put it down.
No problem. I thought that might be the case. Thank you. And our next hand is from John. John, go ahead. John, I see you have your hand up. I have requested you to unmute. You see a pop-up on your screen. Okay, we'll circle back to, oh, there
Thank
he
you.
is.
Sorry.
No problem.
No, I'm sorry. Thank you so much. Yeah, you know, it's trying to figure out new things here. First, I just want to say thank you for the effort. James, I really appreciate the presentation. And I know that the scientists have put in a tremendous amount of work here. And as a scientist myself, I don't envy the position that you're all in, but I do really appreciate the hard work and how difficult it is trying to balance conservation and fisheries. And I just have a couple comments. And first is I'm a little bit concerned about the use of a 10% impact in the statewide steelhead management plan in situations when populations are forecast to be under escaped. As an angler, I do see value. I want to be out there fishing. And I think if these populations are generally abundant and diverse and they're kind of not in decline and they only occasionally miss their goal, I really think that a fishery could be operated in those conditions, and a 10% impact is probably not very much. But I'm not convinced that makes sense when the population is in long-term decline and it's kind of frequently missing its escapement goal, especially considering, I think, as we all know, that despite the tremendous effort you're trying to put forth, there's still a lot of uncertainty about encounter rates, the impacts of catch and release on, you know, diversity and just overall productivity. And there's that mandate to conserve first. And for populations that are kind of chronically depleted, 10% is not necessarily just a nominal impact. And I'm not saying that you're arguing otherwise. So, but I tend to think that successfully managing fish is kind of like successfully managing money. And the models and the science kind of share similarities in that successful, wealthy people invest that capital and live off the returns. And it's like fisheries are very similar. They don't spend down into that capital unless there's an emergency. And fisheries have escapement goals for that same reason. The escapement goals annually represent the capital, and the number of fish over that goal represents the return on that investment. So again, if this were a one-off or the occasional break in case of emergency, I can understand. But as mentioned earlier by one person, I think as we've seen in the data and other presentations, there are longer-term problems for places like the Willapa and Chehalis. And given that context and the uncertainty associated with fishery impacts, I think it's probably more appropriate to close those fisheries, unfortunately, until they have time to kind of rebuild their biological capital, or there is sufficient time to evaluate the problem and figure out whether you might need different escapement goals. Second, if you close those watersheds, some anglers will probably give it up for the year. Some people love those places, but most won't. And orphan anglers, as they did when Puget Sound was closed, will shift their effort to places like the Quileute, the Hoh, and the Upper Quinault, maybe the Queets. And of those, of course, only the Quileute is really forecast to be relatively abundant, but I use that term kind of with caution because the predicted run size is still pretty small when you look at the long-term history. Nonetheless, I do think those rivers can support well-managed conservative fisheries that don't allow fishing from a boat, but do offer seasons like you've done in the past few years that are sufficiently long to kind of appease some of the anglers and give people time on the water. But I want to argue against a couple points. And the first is that, you know, the WFW creel data indicate that the vast majority of encounters occur in the lower reaches of the rivers. And so there has been some argument by some folks to allow boat fishing in the lower reaches, but not in the upper ones. But based on the creel data and given the very nominal amounts of fish that are caught in those upper reaches when boat fishing was allowed, it wouldn't really have much effect on the overall impact. And I think the second point is this is particularly important for the Saltduck River. And it is a wild steelhead gene bank. And I think, as we all know, it's really critical to the overall Quileute River population. And some anglers have suggested allowing fishing from a boat in the lower reaches of the Saltduck and increasing impacts on that river. I think that's absolutely the wrong direction to take. I think gene bank rivers are investments and should be managed more conservatively. And given the likely shift in effort and the importance of the fleet overall, I tend to believe that the most appropriate approach for this year is to kind of continue with last year's regulations until we really begin to see true on the ground increases in run size and escapement. And just thank you for allowing me to comment, and thank you for the presentation.
Thanks.
And our last hand that is up right now is from Julie. Julie, go ahead.
Oh, thank you, James and team, for all your hard work and efforts. I just want to concur with Luke, Rich, and John McMillan on taking the more of the conservation side of the Steelhead proposals. You know, even with closures, I believe in my heart the Steelhead will not be forgotten. And so I hope you take in close consideration of what these other people have said about the conservation efforts towards the Steelhead proposals. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks.
Okay, we have a couple more hands up here. Our next hand is from Ed. Ed, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hey, thanks everybody. Thanks, James. Everybody, again, really appreciate you guys doing all these town halls. It really shows that you guys are really trying to do something to change the state of things. I just wanted to touch back on what Rich and John said earlier. You know, as we have more and more people fishing every day, and with the uncertainty and all the catch rates and the availability of all the data, the only thing that really makes sense is, you know, like somebody said, reducing the efficacy of the way that people are fishing. That way more and more people can keep fishing and learning about these fish and experiencing all these things that we keep talking about, to make it more sustainable for future generations, because you can only think that more and more people are going to be fishing year after year, and it just needs to be, you know, there needs to be some kind of restriction on, just like big game hunting. This is the big game hunting of fishing. So it's, yeah, I don't know. We've been on lots of these calls. I really appreciate you guys doing all of these, and that's all I got to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Appreciate it.
And our next hand is from Larry. Larry, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, just a thought on your options. I believe we should manage them river by river. I think that's the best way, especially since we don't know exactly what the movement of fishermen would be from one side to another. And then lastly, which is kind of off this topic, but I think we need to look more at the survivability of eggs and smolt in the rivers and how we can improve that, getting more smolt out to the salt. Thank you.
Thanks, Larry. Appreciate it.
And next is Joey. Joey, go ahead.
Thanks, James. Sorry about that. I do have a question on the kind of the threat of an early closure like it was faced last year. And, you know, the only, I guess, better way to prevent that might be, you know, monitoring in season, improved monitoring. But I guess the question on the potential for closure is, are there any estimates on the efficacy of shutting things down early, or what the impact was of the early closure last year in relation to the escapement totals and kind of some of the slides, some of the information on the earlier slide in the presentation?
Yeah. It's an important point, Joey, and I'll share it briefly here, just to stay on task though. In the last town hall, we talked a lot about this, but I think it's a really important point though. So it's a good question. So this table here, if we look at the Quileute, the forecast was 8,516. The actual run size was about 400 fish higher than that. So the run came in higher than expected. Mid-season in February, catch estimates were suggesting the run could be half of what was expected. There was a ton of uncertainty about flow and river conditions, but we saw tribal fisheries with consistent effort were not catching wild steelhead at the rate that was expected. In fact, some cases 30 or 40% what was expected. So out of an abundance of caution and really a lack of in-season monitoring tools, the fishery was closed in season. And so on the spawning grounds, we were extremely concerned. We were about to see something we'd never seen in the Quileute. Relieved postseason to see that we did meet the escapement. So we escaped 8,000 fish and the goal was 5,900. So we talked about this last town hall, how if we're in this situation again, the tools we have available are the same we've had in the past. So unfortunately, the co-managers would probably likely, with a run size that appears to be half of what was expected, probably have to make a really similar decision, or at least have the exact same discussion we had last year. So thanks, Joey.
Yeah, and so a real follow-up on that, the only proposal then, how do you improve in-season monitoring? Is there a financial amount that would allow more creel checkers, more people on the river so that you could keep kind of better total, counts, to see kind of what's actually going on? And if there was a number, is there a way to do like a stamp or a conservation stamp or something on license fees? Like, I don't know how technical that is, but how could you kind of get some funding to support better in-season monitoring? Because it seems like it keeps coming back to that. If there's a better way to kind of determine the state of the run and how many fish are being caught, it kind of just removes some of the blind guesswork that's going on each season.
Yeah, two things. I'll be brief. Yes, there's a funding request right now attached to the coastal steelhead proviso. That was released to the public today for a 10-day review period. Folks should go check that out. And there's a variety of tools we highlight there that are available today in terms of the technology. So those could include high precision creel, like we're talking about here. Multiple years of creel give you an expectation of what you should be seeing in season. And then if you don't see what you thought you would, you can make adjustments. Sonar, there's technology there that can provide real-time estimates. So you can check that out there. The other thing I want to highlight though is in-season update tools become extremely important when we design fisheries with a small margin of error. So the Quileute, while that was extremely frustrating for folks, we knew moving into the season, like we are this season, any of these fisheries we design, we're going to be watching them extremely close and concerned the whole season because we're seeing these declining runs. So as we have abundant stocks, the in-season update tools become much less important. Today, I think though you're highlighting, this is a huge gap for us. The short fix is sport fish monitoring. We just have to have it and we don't. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. And our next hand is from D. Ferg. You can unmute yourself now.
Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, my question was really along the lines of kind of what Joey just said about the monitoring, but I also kind of wanted to ask questions about, like, for example, in the Forks area, we closed down in the end of February, and then once March hit, we had a ton of water, like the majority of the month, and I'm just trying to figure out how you guys get, good numbers, or how you guys figure out how many fish are coming in when the water's so high, if you can't count spawning beds. And then just wondering how many spawning beds get missed in February. For example, we had a lot of spawning in the lower sole duck, middle sole duck throughout February, and it seemed like a lot of that stuff wasn't getting counted. And then, you know, another thing I wanted to kind of ask about was our April fishery. Now, a lot of us used to love April, and you know, I'm totally cool about cutting it just because we're trying to help that portion of the run. But it seems like we're trying to build on this investment and reinvest dividends. I wonder why we have essentially a salmon commercial opener like throughout the month of April, and it seems like we could be intercepting a lot of incoming April fish, and then also the March kelts that are going out too. So I'm just trying to figure out how we're going to build that portion of the run with some of that stuff kind of going on.
Yeah, thanks. So the April kelp data gap is a big one. And our fisheries in recent years have, with these emergency regulations, have probably provided both state and tribal fisheries increased protection for those. So you'll see one of these options includes that, you know, or multiple of them include the no April. Some of those savings are really tough to model. You know, they sort of leave the abundance metric behind when you're talking about protecting kelts on their outmigration. And we're talking more now about diversity and productivity and things like that. So yeah, that's on our mind. And I don't really have anything to speak to missed reds because our standardized procedure should capture, you know, missed reds with high flow. The red life in those high flow environments may change from, instead of 30 days, it may range to 14 days and then they're gone. So those reds that you saw in February, if steelhead reds were captured by our team, that said, our red counting tool, it's not, you know, foolproof. Like there are mistakes made, but the assumption is it's been a tool we've been using, you know, in some stretches since the 60s. So we should talk more about it though, because in the sole duck, we know there's a summer coho population. We heard a lot of buzz about all the reds that we're seeing. But good news is, looking at the final escapement, it looks like we did a good job of capturing what was above the escapement goal and escapement in the end. So anyway, lots more to talk about.
Awesome. You know what, like, you know, some things I do see when I see like creel checkers and stuff, like there seems to be quite an abundance on the hoe. But when I go to the Quileute system, we got Talking Tom, and I love Tom. He does a great job, but it just seems like we're really lacking over there on the Quileute system. And I'm on the water every single day. And of course, you know, I talk to a lot of people around here, and this is kind of stuff I'm hearing. And I do appreciate you guys and what you do. And, you know, I want to see this fishery survive and go forward because I do care about it very much, just like we all do. Thank you.
Thank you.
And our next hand is from Caleb. Caleb, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a couple things. You know, I think I probably echo a lot of the people who are calling for a pretty conservative fishery. You know, especially in light of, you know, last year's early closure to a season that was already shortened. I think the likelihood of fishing a longer season with really, you know, conservative regulations is a lot higher than if we open it up and just kind of see what happens, you know. The other thing I kind of wanted to talk about is this number, the sport impact number on the Quileute, I think is a little deceiving. You know, I think it's easy to look at that and say, well, there's 1,700 fish over escapement for 4 sport fishermen, you know, but that's divided into a lot of rivers, right? And you know, half of those rivers easily have not been doing all that well the last however many years. So I think that's something that has to really be sort of pinpointed, and you know, that people need to remember. It's, you know, 1,700 fish seems like a lot. If it was one river, it might be, but it's a lot of rivers. So I think that's a pretty big thing to remember. The last thing that I wanted to ask about, James, was this, the hatchery forecast for the cleats. It says it's a late winter hatchery return, and I was a little, I guess I was a little lost in that. are the fish that come back into the salmon, for instance, are they not included in this, or are those considered a late winter return?
They are. I think I know the answer to this, but I'm gonna let Rob. I know Rob knows the answer, so. And while Rob tees up here, Caleb, I just want to make sure I heard that proposal right. So you would argue for a more conservative regulation that would protect like the full duration of a season. So maybe have a bigger margin of error so we could go fishing through the whole scheduled season versus the risk of an E-reg.
Right. Yep.
Okay, good, thanks.
Yeah, so right, that Salmon River production was right from the Quinaults, Lake Quinault. And I think over time it's starting to hedge its way a little bit towards earlier time, but it was derived, my understanding was derived from a late winter steelhead out of the Quinault.
Okay, because I mean those fish are in the salmon, by Thanksgiving.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of hedging towards earlier and earlier, and we've actually seen that in some of our integrated programs too.
Okay. That clears that up. Thanks.
Thanks, Caleb.
Yep.
Okay, and it looks like Patrick has his hand up again. Patrick, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
All right. Well, I'm just going to reiterate, and I don't even think I gave my opinion on which model we should go after, but I'm kind of disappointed that there's not a bunch of other of my buddies on here and colleagues and other people I fish around, because I hear a lot of people talking for conservative, very conservative approaches, and I am all for that for wild fish protection. However, we will never know what we actually get if we do not have seasons. If we are not fishing, we're not gonna know what we have. And the only thing we have to go off of is spawner surveys and after the fact surveys, instead of having real-time anglers on the water. So I'm going to push, and hundreds of other people will agree with me, we need to advocate for fisheries. We need to be fishing. It is our right. Those hatchery fish are ours, and we are the only ones that can provide the data to make things better. And the only way to do that is by being on the water. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick.
Okay, and our next hand is from Jonathan. Jonathan, go ahead.
Hi, I just had a question about how you guys calculate the mortality goal. I know you guys already talked about that Idaho study that mentioned it at about more of 4%. But if you have the numbers of actual run size versus escapement, why wouldn't you just calculate it from your actual run size and escapement on each river and average that for your mortality goal?
Jonathan, I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're saying, but I do think it's important. So I'm going to ask that you reach out directly to us via email. We can even schedule, time to sit down and look at the spreadsheets and try to understand if you've got an idea, a better way to calculate non-harvest mortality or encounter rates. So can we table that and focus on that proposal?
I'll send you an email about that. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan.
Okay.
Okay, and our next hand is from Mark. Mark, go ahead. Mark? Oh, there you go. We can hear you.
Sorry, yeah, I was just switching to phone audio. Hey, I just want to reiterate, or I should say, echo what Patrick just said a minute ago. Fishing on the water, getting real-time data from being on the water as an angler. I couldn't agree more.
Thanks, Mark.
Okay, and our next hand is from Brad. Brad, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just like to, looking at the options there, definitely support a status quo fishery on the Quinault system. If those fish are available, I think getting guys back in a boat and, allowing children and veterans and elderly to participate in that fishery would be a great thing. And, taking the conservative approach on some of the other watersheds would definitely be the right approach.
Thanks, Brad.
And it looks like our last hand is Reve. Reve, you're good to go.
So James, I just wanted to go back to that analysis of options. So when I was speaking to those 2016 regulation changes, that would potentially have impact on the sport impact limit, and that number is under what it could be if those regulations were considered in there, and therefore would give us more fishery options. So on the proposal discussion for the Hoh River, based on historical creel data, it looks like April accounted for a large portion of the caught fish in those creel data censuses that were taken, and that was about 25% of total fishery catches. So just an April closure would be a 25% impact. That's what we would request on the Hoh. So a regulation pamphlet fishery with an April closure. For the Quileute River system, its sport impact limit is really high. And I know you guys have concerns about the Bogoshiel being under escapement. So given that river being one of concern, we would suggest closing the Bogoshiel from about 3/4 of a mile above the hatchery upstream for the entire winter steelhead season. And the rest of the Quileute system would be full regulation pamphlet fishery. Thanks.
Hey, thanks, Reve. I just want to make sure I get this proposal right, because I think these are consistent with what you sent in, and I've read those. If there's changes, I want to know, but the proposal you just described for the Quileute could be, I mean, it's nuanced, but it could be described as this fish from a boat in select waters. So I don't know if you can see my arrow hovering, but so thanks for a proposal that seems to be sort of fitting within the management objectives. And then I hear your consideration for April closures. Make sure we're accounting for the savings in April in the Hoh when we estimate the status quo fishery minus April. So thanks for that.
So I just to clarify, it would be status quo with a closure on a portion of the Bogoshiel, not fish from a boat in select waters for the Quileute system. But it was what I sent in. So
yeah, great. Well, we've got it, and I do really appreciate the way you sent that too. Was extremely organized and easy to follow. So thanks for that.
Okay, and it looks like our last hand is from John. John, go ahead.
Yes, hello.
John, are you there?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Sorry. Yeah, it strikes. Oh, I was going to say, yeah, I appreciate all the effort that's gone into the presentations to this point. It seems to me that if the ultimate goal of the WDFW is to conserve the resource, then there's only a couple of systems that are really available for fishing opportunities, and that would be the Hoh and the Quileute. Possibly the upper Quinault, if I can recall the numbers from the previous slide on the goals. But it seems like everything else ought to be off limits. Yeah, upper Quinault looked like it could sustain a fishery. and the hoe and the quileute. And then with respect to the quileute, if the boga shield's in trouble, then you need to do a deeper dive on analyzing that system and providing the appropriate restrictions to conserve the fish. And that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thanks, John.
Okay, and James, that looks like our last hand.
Great. Well, we'll pause for a minute, make sure there's no final thoughts, and maybe remind people the portal has been a really effective tool for us to get people's regulations in. So I know there's people on this call. I can see the names of folks that have submitted information through the portal and via email. Also want to encourage folks, if there's when I introduced everybody early on, there's bios that lead this work in each region, each district. So if there's a certain fishery that's really important to you, feel free to reach right out to one of the folks on this call and dig into some of the limitations or considerations. So.
Maybe James, as we pause here for a moment, if I could just take a second and just extend my appreciation to everybody who attended tonight. We heard some good stuff. I think mission accomplished from a feedback perspective. So thanks to all of you who took the time to think through this stuff and provide us some stuff to chew on. Greatly appreciated. Thank you. And maybe I'll just add one other thing. If you haven't seen it yet, we sent out a notification here a while ago announcing our final town hall meeting, which is scheduled for the evening of the 28th. We're going to be talking about where we landed with regard to the regulation package. If you're interested in a kind of a preview of how the agency's thinking about that, we will be meeting with, as James mentioned, our fish committee on the 17th of this month to talk through not only some of the ideas that we heard, but how we're thinking about those ideas. So encourage you to check the commission webpage for that agenda when it gets posted, and encourage you to listen in on that. Leah, do we have any other hands?
No, it looks like we are all done with comments and questions.
Okay. Again, thanks everybody for taking the time. Hope this was as informative for you all as it was for us. Much appreciation for you spending the evening with us. Take care. If you're off tomorrow, enjoying the holiday, I hope you get a chance to get out and angle a little bit. That's my plan. Maybe I'll see you on the water. Take care, everybody, and thank you.
Happy
Thanks,
Veterans
everybody.
Day.